reconnaissance aircraft. Early models were powered by 900 horsepower BMW Brahmo engines. These engines gave the plane a maximum speed of about 250 miles per hour at an altitude of 13,000 feet. The pilots loved the aircraft because of its handling characteristics and maneuverability. The range of the aircraft was also limited. The normal tactical radius was only about 300 miles. In an effort to improve the plane, the engines were uprated to 1,000 horsepower in the Z series. However, the addition of a fifth crew member in the redesigned nose and an increase in the number of machine guns added so much weight that performance was actually worse, reducing the fighting radius to about 200 miles. The Dornier 17Z saw its baptism of fire during the Polish campaign in September 1939. It was used to bomb airfields, bridges, and troops. The aircraft had a similar role during the invasion of the Western Front in May 1940. The Dornier 17Z was used next during the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. It went on to the Eastern Front for Operation Barbarossa in June of the same year, supporting Hitler's massive land and air attack on the Soviet Union. The last machines were withdrawn from service in November of 1942. The Dornier 215, powered first by Gnome-Rhone radials and then by 1,075 horsepower Daimler-Benz inline engines, was an unsuccessful replacement for the 17. The 112 that were built saw their principal service as reconnaissance aircraft. A more successful model was the Dornier 217, which was in reality a beefed-up 215. Development of a larger version of the Dornier 17 began in 1937, with the first flight a year later. The aircraft did not enter service until late in 1940 because it took 2 years to find suitable engines. The two models looked almost identical, but the new version was longer and had a greater wingspan, as well as new, more powerful engines capable of 1,750 horsepower. These power plants gave the 217 a maximum speed of 348 miles per hour. These improvements increased the range of the aircraft to about 1,300 miles and allowed it to penetrate deep into enemy territory without having to carry drop tanks for extra fuel. On top of this, the Dornier could carry over 8,800 pounds of bombs and rockets in its bomb bays and on its wings. This was a much greater load than any other German bomber of the period. The aircraft was equipped with a single 15mm cannon and 7 machine guns to defend itself against enemy fighters. The Dornier stayed in service right to the end of the war. The Henschel 123 was the Luftwaffe's last operational biplane. It had been planned as a dive bomber, but entered service as a close ground support aircraft. The Henschel saw its first combat in Spain in 1937 and reappeared throughout the war in Poland, France, and Russia. But by the middle of 1944, the 60 airframes that had been built were destroyed. The Henschel 123 was a remarkably strong and versatile aircraft. The Yonkers 86, like the Heinkel, was originally designed as an airliner, but because of the war, the aircraft went on to see action as a bomber. It had a retractable ventral turret for one of its 3 defensive machine guns. The other guns were located in the nose and the dorsal cockpit. The first operational bomber model served in the Spanish Civil War and was found to be very vulnerable to enemy fighters. As a result of this, several improvements were made. The 600 horsepower engines were replaced by BMW 800s, which increased their speed to 200 miles per hour. Despite the improvements, these versions were already obsolete after the Polish campaign and withdrawn from service. The later versions of the Yonkers 86P saw tremendous improvements. It had a fully pressurized cockpit and an 84-foot wingspan with supercharged diesel engines. The Yunker could reach an altitude of around 40,000 feet and a cruising speed of 160 miles per hour, even with 2,200 pounds of bombs on board. As a bomber, it proved no more successful than the earlier models, though. And after several had been shot down by high-altitude Spitfires, it was assigned to reconnaissance duties in Russia. A few Junker 86Ps were modified again and given the type designation 86R. This version of the Junker had a greater wingspan and faster engines, which were upgraded to 1,000 horsepower, allowing them to reach altitudes of over 47,000 feet. But they were still no match for the Spitfires. The Junkers 86R saw limited service during 1943 and 1944 and were phased out of service shortly thereafter. Italy entered the war in 1940. Its air force was weak, but had some adequate medium bombers. The LTony was a land plane development of a twin-float seaplane and first flew in 1937. Deliveries to Regia Aeronautica began in 1939. The first 35 LTonies were powered by 840 horsepower Isata Fraschini inline engines. They were underpowered and undergunned, so a number of modifications were rushed through. New 1,000 horsepower Piaggio radial engines were installed, giving the LTony a maximum speed of over 280 miles per hour. In addition, 2 of the guns were replaced by heavier 12.7 millimeter caliber weapons. The heavy machine gun in the dorsal turret was aerodynamically counterbalanced, so the turret could be traversed manually. Later in the production run, the single tail was replaced by a twin tail. The LTony was the most important Italian bomber of the Second World War after the Spaviero SM-79, and in place of its 4,400-pound bomb load, it could carry a pair of 1,000-pound anti-shipping torpedoes. In 1942, Kant introduced an advanced version of the LTony with 1,175 horsepower Piaggio radial engines. This model had a reduced bomb load of 2,200 pounds, giving the aircraft better performance and longer range. Over 500 LTonies were built. They saw service in North Africa, the Balkans, and the depths of Russia. A few were even briefly stationed in France to help the Luftwaffe attack British targets. The LTonies proved very vulnerable to Allied fighters in the Mediterranean theater. The Spaviero, with its defensive armament of 3 12.7 and 1 7.7 millimeter machine guns, proved its worth during the Spanish Civil War as well. The crews nicknamed the aircraft Gobbo Maledetto, or Damned Hunchback, because of its ungainly appearance. But this did not prevent the aircraft from effectively doing its job. The Spaviero was without a doubt Italy's most successful medium bomber during the Second World War. The aircraft took part in the Italian invasions of Albania, Russia, and most significantly, during the siege of Malta. The SM-79 was particularly successful as an anti-shipping aircraft and was the best land-based torpedo bomber of the war. In this role, carrying a single 18-inch torpedo under the fuselage, they did an enormous amount of damage to Allied convoys on the Malta and North Africa runs, particularly the Pedestal convoy in August 1942. One of Japan's principal aircraft involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor was the Kawasaki light bomber, codenamed Lily by the Allies. The Lily went into production in 1939, and nearly 2,000 were